The clock on the station wall read 12:01 a.m. as David stood alone on the platform. He had missed the last regular train home, and now he was stranded in a part of the city he didn't know well. The wind whipped through the station, sending a shiver down his spine. He checked his phone, no messages, no signal. Just as he was about to give up and call a cab, he heard the distant sound of a train approaching. But that didn't make sense. There were no more trains running at this hour. As the sound grew louder, a sleek, black train emerged from the darkness, sliding to a stop in front of him. The carriages were old, their metal sides glinting faintly under the station lights. The doors opened with a soft hiss, and a cold breeze drifted out from the inside. David hesitated. No conductor, no other passengers, no schedule. But the station was deserted, and he was desperate to get home. Against his better judgment, he stepped inside. The carriage was eerily quiet, dimly lit by old-fashioned gas lamps mounted on the walls. The seats were worn, their upholstery faded and cracked. There was no one else aboard. David walked cautiously down the aisle, feeling the unsettling emptiness around him. He found a seat near the window and sat down, hoping this mysterious train would take him somewhere familiar. The train jolted into motion, the sound of the wheels clattering on the tracks breaking the silence. David looked out the window, but instead of the city streets, all he saw was darkness. No lights, no buildings, just an endless black void. As the train picked up speed, something began to feel wrong. The air inside the carriage grew colder, and a faint mist started to form at the edges of the windows. David could hear faint whispers, barely audible, as if they were coming from the very walls of the train. He strained to listen, but the words were unclear, swirling just out of reach. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the train lurched violently to one side. David gripped the armrests, his heart pounding. The train seemed to be speeding up, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels turning into a frantic roar. The carriage began to shake, and the mist thickened, swirling around his feet. He stood up, panicking. The windows were now completely fogged over, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. David stumbled toward the front of the carriage, hoping to find a conductor or anyone, who could explain what was happening. But as he reached the next door, it refused to open. He yanked at it, but it was stuck, sealed shut. Behind him, the whispers intensified, filling the carriage with an oppressive, suffocating sound. David whipped around and froze. The seats that had been empty just moments ago were now occupied by figures. Shadowy, indistinct figures, their faces hidden in the gloom. They were sitting still, motionless, but their heads were all turned toward him, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. David's breath caught in his throat. He stepped back, his heart hammering in his chest. The figures didn't move, didn't speak, but he could feel their presence bearing down on him, cold and malevolent. The air grew thicker, the whispers now a cacophony of disjointed voices. Suddenly, the train screeched to a halt. David was thrown to the floor, the impact knocking the wind out of him. As he struggled to his feet, the door at the front of the carriage slid open with a slow, metallic groan. Beyond it, a narrow hallway stretched out into the darkness. With no other choice, David stepped into the hallway. The walls were covered in rust and grime, the floor creaking under his weight. He moved cautiously, the whispers following him, growing louder with each step. The hall twisted and turned, leading him deeper into the train, farther from the safety of the platform. He reached another door at the end of the hall, its surface cold to the touch. Taking a deep breath, he pushed it open. The room beyond was filled with old, decaying luggage, suitcases, trunks, bags piled high in a chaotic heap. But what drew David's attention was the figure standing in the center of the room. It was a man, dressed in a conductor's uniform, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow and black. The conductor smiled, but it was not a friendly smile. It was a smile that sent chills through David's entire body. "You're not supposed to be here," the conductor said, his voice soft but full of malice. David backed away, shaking his head. I just want to go home." The conductor's smile widened, revealing sharp, yellowed teeth. "This is your home now," he said, taking a step closer. You boarded the train. Now you'll ride it forever. Before David could react, the luggage around him began to shift and move, as if something was crawling beneath it. Slowly, decayed hands emerged from the piles of bags, pale, skeletal hands reaching out toward him. The passengers, or what was left of them, were rising from their eternal slumber. Panicking, David turned and ran, but the train was shifting again. The hallway twisted and distorted, the walls closing in around him. The whispers became screams, voices of the dead, crying out in torment. His footsteps echoed through the labyrinthine corridors as he desperately searched for a way out. But the train had no exit. No matter which way he turned, every door led back to the same carriage, the same shadowy figures staring at him with their glowing eyes. The conductor's voice echoed through the train, laughing, mocking. This train never stops. David's vision blurred as the train spiraled deeper into the void, the walls warping and shifting, the shadows closing in on him. He collapsed into a seat, gasping for breath, his mind overwhelmed by fear and despair. The passengers around him leaned closer, their hollow faces inches from his own. And then, everything went silent. The train came to a gentle stop. The doors opened with a soft hiss, revealing the platform beyond. But it wasn't the station David knew. This place was different. Empty, lifeless. The sky above was a dark, swirling mass, and the tracks stretched into an infinite blackness. David stood on shaky legs, stepping out onto the platform. The train behind him sat quietly, waiting, as if it knew he would return. He looked around, but there was nowhere to go. No way back. The whispers began again, faint but ever-present, as David realized the terrible truth. The last stop was never meant to be the end. Rachel had always loved train rides. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the tracks, the scenery rushing by, and the sense of adventure as the train carried her to new places. But this train ride was different. It wasn't on her schedule. In fact, it wasn't on anyone's schedule. It had been a normal evening when she found herself wandering the streets after a late shift. The city's train station was just ahead, and as she approached, she noticed an old, weathered train sitting on the platform. It wasn't on any timetable she recognized, but curiosity got the better of her. The train was different from the modern one she was used to. Its carriages were made of dark wood, with iron accents and narrow windows that gleamed dully in the fading light. A wisp of steam curled from its chimney, and the atmosphere around it felt thick, heavy. There was no one in sight, not a single passenger or conductor. Rachel hesitated for a moment before stepping aboard. The moment she set foot inside, a chill ran down her spine. The air was damp and musty, carrying with it a faint scent of old, rotting wood. She glanced around. The interior was just as antiquated as the exterior. Dim lamps hung from the ceiling, casting an eerie yellow light over the worn leather seats. As she made her way to the back of the carriage, she noticed that there were passengers after all. At least she thought they were. They were all seated, motionless, staring straight ahead. Their faces were pale, almost ghostly, and their eyes seemed vacant. Rachel felt a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. She tried to make eye contact with one of them, a man with hollow cheeks and a sunken gaze, but he didn't react. Not even a blink. She chose a seat near the window, trying to shake off the eerie sensation. The train began to move, slowly at first, then faster, as it rattled down the tracks. The city lights outside faded into the distance, replaced by an expanse of wilderness she didn't recognize. Rachel pressed her forehead against the cool glass, watching the trees blur by. That's when she noticed something strange. The landscape outside didn't make sense. The trees, the hills, the valleys, they were all twisted wrong. The trees were too tall, their branches gnarled and reaching out like claws. The sky was a sickly shade of gray, swirling with dark clouds. No stars, no moon, and there were figures, shadowy figures, moving through the trees, keeping pace with the train. Her heart skipped a beat. She leaned closer to the window, trying to get a better look. The The figures were humanoid, but they weren't human. Their limbs were too long, their faces hidden beneath hoods or shadows. One of them turned its head toward her, and even though she couldn't see its eyes, she felt it watching her. It smiled, wide and toothy, before vanishing into the darkness. Rachel pulled back, her breath quickening. She glanced around the carriage again, hoping to find some reassurance from the other passengers, but none of them had moved. They were still seated, still staring ahead, their expressions blank. A sudden noise broke the silence, a metallic creak, followed by footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps coming from the front of the train. Rachel's heart raced as the sound grew closer. She turned toward the aisle, her hands gripping the armrests. A figure appeared in the doorway. It was the conductor, but something was wrong with him. His uniform was tattered, hanging loosely from his skeletal frame. His skin was pale, stretched tight over his bones, and his eyes, black, empty voids, locked onto hers. His mouth twisted into a grotesque grin as he stepped into the carriage, his voice a low rasp. "Tickets, please?" Rachel froze. She didn't have a ticket. She hadn't even bought one. The conductor's smile widened as if he already knew. He slowly made his way down the aisle, pausing at each passenger. None of them moved. None of them handed over tickets. He didn't seem to care. When he reached Rachel, he stopped. His bony hand extended toward her, palm up. "Your ticket?" he whispered, his voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. I don't have one," she stammered, her throat dry. The conductor tilted his head, his grin never faltering. "No ticket?" he hissed. "Then you belong here." Before Rachel could react, his hand shot forward, grabbing her wrist with an icy grip. She tried to pull away, but his strength was unnatural, unyielding. He dragged her to her feet, pulling her toward the door at the front of the carriage. "No," she cried, struggling against him. "Let me go." But he didn't let go. The door opened, revealing the next carriage, an old, decrepit car filled with shadows. It was colder in there, the air thick with the stench of decay. Rachel could barely make out the shapes of the passengers, slumped in their seats, motionless. As the conductor dragged her inside, she realized with horror that they weren't passengers at all. They were corpses. Some were little more than skeletons, their clothing tattered and covered in dust. Others were freshly dead, their skin still gray and sunken, their eyes staring blankly into the void. The train wasn't just a mode of transportation, it was a tomb. Rachel's mind raced as the conductor pulled her deeper into the car, past rows of the dead. She had to escape. She couldn't end up like them. Summoning every ounce of strength, she wrenched her arm free and bolted for the door. Behind her, she heard the conductor's rasping voice, followed by a chorus of whispers from the dead. "You can't leave. You belong here." She flung the door open and stumbled into the next carriage. But it wasn't the same train anymore. The world outside the windows had vanished, replaced by an endless, swirling void. The train itself seemed to stretch on forever, an infinite series of carriages filled with the dead. There was no escape. The last thing Rachel saw before the darkness closed in was the conductor's twisted smile and the sound of his voice, echoing in her mind. "Welcome to the ghost train." It was a cold autumn night when Alex boarded the train. The station was nearly empty, the silence broken only by the distant hum of the train's engine. The clock above the platform read 11:45 p.m. He had never taken the midnight train before, but his job required him to work late tonight. As the door slid shut behind him, Alex felt a shiver creep down his spine, though he couldn't tell if it was from the cold or something more unsettling. The train was dimly lit, with flickering lights that gave the carriage an eerie, yellowish glow. There were only a few other passengers scattered throughout the car, most of them dozing off in their seats. Alex found an empty spot near the back and settled in, pulling out his phone to pass the time. But the signal was gone. He frowned, holding his phone higher, hoping to catch a bar of service. Nothing. Strange, he thought. The train was still within city limits. There should be coverage. He glanced out the window, but all he could see was a thick fog pressing against the glass. No lights, no buildings, just an endless wall of gray. The train lurched forward, and Alex turned his attention back to the interior. As he scanned the car, something caught his eye. At the far end of the carriage, seated in the shadows, was a man dressed in an old-fashioned suit and hat. His face was obscured by the brim of the hat, but there was something unnerving about him, something that made Alex's skin crawl. Trying to shake off the feeling, Alex settled deeper into his seat and closed his eyes. He must have dozed off because when he opened them again, the train was moving through what seemed like a dense, endless forest. The fog had lifted, replaced by tall, dark trees that seemed to stretch out forever. He checked the time on his phone, 12:30 a.m. That can't be right, he muttered to himself. The journey shouldn't have taken more than half an hour. But there was no sign of the city, no familiar landmarks, just trees. As Alex looked around, he realized something else had changed. The other passengers were gone. The seats that had been filled earlier were now empty, except for the man in the suit. He was still there, motionless, at the far end of the carriage. Alex's heart began to race. He stood up, intending to find the conductor and demand answers. But as he stepped into the aisle, the lights flickered again. This time, when they came back on, the man in the suit was closer. Much closer. He was now seated only a few rows ahead of Alex, still obscured by shadow. But Alex could see his mouth. It was twisted into a wide, unnatural grin. Fear gripped Alex. He moved toward the door to the next carriage, but as he reached for the handle, the lights went out completely. He froze in the darkness, heart pounding, listening to the sound of his own shallow breathing. Then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving toward him. The lights flickered back on, and Alex turned to find the man standing inches away, his grin impossibly wide. His eyes were dark voids, empty and soulless. Alex stumbled backward, his hand fumbling for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The man tilted his head, his voice a low, raspy whisper. "You're not supposed to be here." Alex's mind raced. He had to get out, had to escape. He threw his weight against the door, and with a loud screech, it finally slid open. He stumbled into the next carriage, slamming the door shut behind him. The lights in this car were brighter, but there were still no other passengers. Just rows and rows of empty seats. As Alex caught his breath, he noticed something else. The windows were gone. The walls of the train had become solid metal, trapping him inside. Panic set in, and he ran down the aisle, toward the front of the train. But every door he opened led to another identical carriage, empty and windowless. The train seemed endless, an infinite loop of metal and flickering lights. Just as he was about to give up, the lights went out again. This time, the darkness was absolute. He couldn't see his hand in front of his face, couldn't hear anything except his own frantic heartbeat. Then, from somewhere behind him, a voice echoed through the blackness. "You're never leaving." Alex turned to run, but his feet wouldn't move. It was as if the floor had turned to quicksand, pulling him down, trapping him. He could feel the cold metal beneath him, feel the walls closing in. The voice grew louder, more insistent. "You're one of us now." Suddenly, the lights flickered back to life, and Alex found himself back in his seat, the train moving smoothly along the tracks. The fog had returned, pressing against the windows, but now the other passengers were back, sitting quietly as if nothing had happened. Alex's heart pounded in his chest as he looked around. Everything seemed normal, but something was off. He glanced down at his hands. They were pale, almost translucent, and when he tried to stand, he couldn't. His body felt heavy, weighed down by an invisible force. Then he saw his reflection in the window. The man in the suit was staring back at him,